Welcome back to the channel, and today we are diving deep into one of the most anticipated action films of 2026, Mortal Kombat 2. This is the movie that fans of the franchise have been waiting years for, and there is genuinely so much to unpack here, from where it was made to who made it, to every brutal detail of its story. So let us get right into it. Overview. Mortal Kombat 2 is a 2026 American martial arts dark fantasy film and a direct sequel to the 2021 Mortal Kombat reboot, making it the fourth installment in the Mortal Kombat film series overall. It is directed by Simon Macwood, who returned to helm the franchise after the mixed but commercially successful first film, and written by Jeremy Slater. The film is distributed by Warner Bros. Pictures and produced through James Wan's Atomic Monster banner alongside Broken Road Productions, with producers Todd Garner, James Wan, Toby Emmerich, and E. Bennett Walsh all attached to the project. At its core, the film follows Earthrealm's champions as they face the greatest threat they have ever encountered in the terrifying form of Shao Kahn, the ruthless emperor of our world, with the fate of their entire world hanging in the balance. The film carries a hard R rating for extreme violence, blood, and the kind of brutal fatalities that fans of the franchise have always demanded, and it runs at 1 hour and 56 minutes, giving the story enough room to breathe without overstaying its welcome. What makes this sequel particularly special is that it does something the first film deliberately held back on: it actually stages the tournament. The 2021 Mortal Kombat was described by its own cast and writers as essentially a prologue, a film that built the world and introduced the characters before the real battle could begin. Greg Russo, who co-wrote the original film, confirmed to Collider that he sees the reboot as a trilogy: the first film set before the tournament, the second during the tournament, and the third after it. With that framework in mind, Mortal Kombat 2 is the pivotal centerpiece of an entire cinematic plan, and it arrives with significantly more ambition, a bigger cast, a larger budget, and far higher stakes than anything the franchise has attempted on screen before. The film premiered at the iconic TCL Chinese Theater in Hollywood on April 27, 2026, and was then theatrically released across the United States on May 8, 2026. It was previously scheduled to release on October 24, 2025, before being pushed to the summer window, which Warner Bros. Felt gave it far better box office prospects against a wider audience. The studio was right to make that call, as the summer slot placed Mortal Kombat 2 right in the heart of blockbuster season. The film was also released in IMAX format, which was a deliberate creative decision made during production to ensure the arena battles and realm-shifting sequences could be experienced on the largest screens possible. Where was it made and who made it? The production of Mortal Kombat 2 is very much an Australian story. Principal photography began on June 22, 2023, at Village Roadshow Studios in Gold Coast, Queensland, which stands as one of the largest and most sophisticated film studio complexes in all of Australia. The production team chose this location for several key reasons: the established permanent studio infrastructure, the availability of large-scale set construction facilities, the generous Australian government filming incentives, and access to the region's incredibly diverse natural landscapes. Queensland's subtropical terrain allowed the filmmakers to recreate ancient battlegrounds, forest environments, and rugged outdoor terrain that fits seamlessly within the Mortal Kombat universe without ever needing to travel far from the studio base. However, the production did not run smoothly from start to finish. Filming was interrupted by the 2023 SAG-AFTRA strike, which brought Hollywood productions around the world to a halt. Mortal Kombat 2 was among those affected, pausing mid-production before resuming in November 2023 and ultimately wrapping in January 2024. This meant the project experienced a substantial interruption of several months, which inevitably extended the timeline and contributed to the eventual delay from the original October 2025 release date to May 2026. Despite these challenges, the filmmakers came out the other side with a polished and ambitious product, aided by the fact that the core crew, including cinematographer Stephen F. Windon, a longtime collaborator on the Fast and Furious franchise, brought a high level of visual consistency and energy to the finished film. The production budget was set at $80 million, a significant step up from the $55 million budget of the 2021 original. That $25 million increase reflected a deliberate push into larger set pieces, an expanded roster of game-accurate characters, elaborate fatality sequences, and the addition of a major star in Karl Urban. The elevated budget gave director Simon McWhite and his team the resources to realize far more of the Mortal Kombat universe's iconic fighters and locations than had been possible before, combining practical effects with advanced visual effects technology to deliver more fluid and dynamic fight choreography. It is worth noting plot details. The story of Mortal Kombat 2 begins long before the events of the film itself. In a flashback sequence that sets the entire emotional and narrative foundation of the movie, Emperor Shao Kahn kills King Jarrett of Idnia in single combat during the Mortal Kombat tournament. Having won that brutal contest, Shao Kahn seizes the entire realm of Idnia for Outworld, taking Queen Sindel as his consort and adopting the young Princess Kitana as his own daughter. It is a scene of conquest and darkness that immediately establishes Shao Kahn as a villain of enormous menace, not just a physical threat but a conqueror of worlds with the power to erase entire civilizations from existence. 20 years pass. With the 10th Mortal Kombat tournament now approaching, a tournament of enormous significance in the franchise's lore, Shao Kahn dispatches his sorcerer Quan Chi to resurrect fallen warriors for Outworld's cause. Quan Chi successfully brings back both Kung Lao and Kano from the dead. However, there is a complication with Kano. Because he is already so fundamentally corrupt as a person, Quan Chi is unable to further corrupt or control him, meaning Kano retains his own twisted free will rather than becoming a mindless servant of Outworld. Back in Earthrealm, Lord Raiden and Sonya Blade are scrambling to assemble a team of 5 champions to represent their realm in the tournament. They need a 5th fighter to complete their roster, and their search leads them to Johnny Cage, a washed-up Hollywood actor who happens to possess remarkable martial arts abilities that he has largely wasted on B-movie film sets. Raiden and Sonya track Cage down and ask him to fight, but Johnny, cynical, and the tournament begins, and the Earthrealm champions, Sonya Blade, Liu Kang, Jax Briggs, and Cole Young, enter the arena against Outworld's assembled warriors. Meanwhile, Kitana, who has been raised by Shao Kahn as his daughter but has never fully embraced his brutality, begins to question her loyalty and her identity. She is a woman torn between the father figure who raised her and the realm that was stolen from her before. As the tournament progresses, the scale of Shao Kahn's power and ambition becomes increasingly terrifying. Quan Chi is revealed to possess a powerful amulet that is key to Outworld's strategy, and it becomes clear that simply winning fights in the tournament may not be enough to save Earthrealm. Johnny Cage, despite his earlier refusal, eventually finds himself drawn into the conflict, and it is during the battles that follow that his hidden abilities begin to surface, suggesting that there is far more to him than the failing actor facade he has spent years hiding behind. During the climactic final round of the tournament, Shao Kahn delivers a devastating blow to Liu Kang, mortally wounding him. In his final moments, Liu Kang comes to the profound realization that he is not the prophesied champion he always believed himself to be. In a moment of sacrifice and redemption, Liu Kang dissolves into flames, vowing that he will save those who have fallen. It is one of the film's most emotionally charged sequences, bringing a genuine sense of loss to what could have easily been just another action spectacle. Sonya manages to free Kitana from Shao Kahn's grip before being knocked unconscious. Kitana, now liberated and clear in her purpose, publicly rejects Shao Kahn and formally pledges her loyalty to Earthrealm, instantly becoming an additional champion for their cause. She then faces Shao Kahn herself in single combat, a moment the entire film has been building towards since the opening flashback. Meanwhile, Johnny Cage and Kano, unlikely allies brought together by circumstance, join forces with the spirit of Hanzo Hasashi and a reformed Jade to battle the villainous Bai-Han. Together they succeed in destroying Quan Chi's amulet, an act that not only ends the sorcerer's power but awakens Johnny Cage's dormant abilities in a spectacular fashion. Stripped of the immortality that the amulet provided him, Shao Kahn is finally vulnerable. Kitana unmasks and kills him, an act that liberates the realm of Enia and restores it to freedom, with Kitana taking her rightful place as its queen. The tyranny of Shao Kahn comes to an end, but not without enormous cost. Shang Tsung attempts to take advantage of the chaos and finish off the weakened Raiden, but the destruction of the amulet has restored Raiden's full power, and he defeats Shang Tsung with ease. The tournament is over, Earthrealm is saved, and a new chapter for its champions is about to begin. Cast. The cast of Mortal Kombat 2 is one of the most exciting assemblies of talent the franchise has ever put together on screen. Karl Urban leads the new additions as Johnny Cage, bringing his signature wit, physicality, and screen presence to a character that the 2021 film deliberately withheld. Urban's Johnny Cage is described as having a meta, arrogant charm that contrasts beautifully against the more serious warriors around him, and critics have widely agreed that his performance alone is worth the price of admission. Adeline Rudolph joins as Kitana, a character central to the film's emotional core. Rudolph, known for her work on the Netflix series Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, brings both grace and intensity to an Edenian princess who must choose between the man who raised her and the realm that is her true birthright. Tati Gabrielle plays Jade, a warrior whose arc in the film moves from servant of our world to ally of Earthrealm, a journey that gives Gabrielle plenty of dramatic material to work with. Martin Ford steps into the role of the towering Emperor Shao Kahn, bringing enormous physical presence to a character who needed to feel. On the returning cast side, Louis Tan is back as Cole Young, the original film's lead protagonist. Jessica McNamee reprises her role as the tough and capable Sonya Blade. Mechad Brooks returns as Jax Briggs. Ludi Lin is back as Liu Kang, whose arc reaches its tragic and powerful conclusion in this film. Josh Lawson returns as the irredeemably crooked Kano. Max Huang reprises his fan-favorite role as Kung Lao. Joe Taslim is back as Bai-Han, also known as Noob Saibot. Hiroyuki Sanada, the legendary Japanese actor known globally for his work on Shogun, returns as Scorpion, or more specifically the spirit of Hanzo Hasashi. Release date and box office. Mortal Kombat 2 had its world premiere at the TCL Chinese Theater in Hollywood on April 27, 2026, and was then released theatrically across the United States on May 8, 2026. The film was also released on digital HD on June 9, 2026, with a Blu-ray release scheduled for July 28, 2026. On its opening weekend in North America, the film grossed $38.5 million from 3,503 theaters, finishing second at the domestic box office behind The Devil Wears Prada 2. It made $17 million on its opening day alone, including $5.2 million from Thursday night previews. As of mid-June 2026, the film had grossed $80 million in the United States and Canada, and $49 million in international territories, bringing its trailer. 2 trailers were released for the film ahead of its launch. A teaser was released in February 2026, focusing primarily on Karl Urban's Johnny Cage, capturing him as a contemplative, washed-up B-movie actor wrestling with the meaning of his own existence, before cutting to brief but thrilling glimpses of Scorpion, Baraka, and the fighting action to come. A full trailer followed in April 2026, which paid direct homage to the video games with a side-scrolling sequence that sent the internet into an absolute frenzy. Critical reception. Mortal Kombat 2 arrived to significantly warmer reviews than its 2021 predecessor. On Rotten Tomatoes, 64% of critics gave it a positive review, making it one of the higher-rated video game adaptations in recent memory, which, as many pointed out, says something both encouraging about this film and sobering about the state of video game movies in general. Critics praised Karl Urban's performance almost universally, the improved fight choreography, the more faithful adherence to the game's tournament structure, and the emotional weight of Liu Kang's arc. Some reviews noted that the film's story still veers into the realm of the gloriously nonsensical, and a handful of critics felt the narrative momentum dissipated after the climax. But welcome back to the channel. Today we are doing a complete, scene-by-scene, beat-by-beat breakdown of the full story of Mortal Kombat 2. Everything that happens in this movie, from the very first frame to the final moment, told in the most detailed way possible. So sit back, because this is going to be a long and glorious one. Full spoilers ahead, and you have been warned. The film opens not in the present day, but in the ancient kingdom of Enia. It is a land of extraordinary beauty, lush, grand, and noble, a realm that exists apart from both Earthrealm and Outworld, sovereign and proud. We see a young Princess Kitana standing beside her father, King Jared, and her mother, Queen Sindel. The occasion is grim. Jared is about to enter mortal combat against the terrifying Emperor of Outworld, Shao Kahn. This fight has been arranged under the rules of the ancient tournament, and the stakes could not be higher. If Jared loses, Enia falls. If Shao Kahn loses, Outworld's ambitions are checked. The fight begins, and Jared is no weakling. He is a warrior king who puts up a genuine, courageous battle against Shao Kahn. For a moment it almost seems like he might have a chance. But Shao Kahn is not a man who loses. In a brutal and devastating moment, Kahn allows Jared's own blade to impale his hand, and then uses the momentum of that wound to turn the weapon against the king, driving it through him before finishing the job with his enormous war hammer. King Jared dies. The entire kingdom of Enia bows. Shao Kahn looks down at the young Kitana and tells her, calmly and coldly, that she is now his daughter. Queen Sindel becomes his consort. Enia is absorbed into Outworld. It is a scene of pure conquest, and it haunts every single thing that follows. The story then jumps forward 20 years. Kitana is now a grown woman, a lethal and graceful warrior who has spent 2 decades being raised and trained within the world of Shao Kahn. She trains alongside her closest companion and bodyguard, Jade, a fierce and loyal warrior who has been at Kitana's side through everything. In a quiet and personal moment between them, Jade gifts Kitana a pair of bladed fans, the iconic weapons that will define her in the battles to come. These two women share a bond that goes deeper than duty. Jade is not just a bodyguard. Kitana and Jade are then summoned before Shao Kahn and Sindel, where the Emperor outlines his strategy for the upcoming Mortal Kombat tournament. This is not just any tournament, it is the 10th tournament, a number of enormous significance in the lore of the franchise. The rules of Mortal Kombat dictate that if Outworld wins 10 consecutive tournaments against Earthrealm, it gains the right to invade and conquer that realm outright. Shao Kahn is on the verge of achieving exactly that. He brings in Shang Tsung, the scheming and powerful sorcerer who served as the primary villain of the 2021 film, for a specific task. Shang Tsung has been tasked with tracking down and acquiring the Amulet of Shinnok, a supremely powerful artifact that, if wielded correctly, can grant its bearer godlike powers and immortality. This amulet is the key piece in Shao Kahn's plan to guarantee his victory in the tournament, no matter what Earthrealm throws at him. Meanwhile, the necromancer Quan Chi, one of the most sinister figures in the entire Mortal Kombat universe, is carrying out another piece of Shao Kahn's strategy. Under the Emperor's direct orders, Quan Chi uses his dark magic to resurrect 2 warriors who died in the previous film. The first is Kung Lao, the razor hat-wielding champion who was killed in the 2021 movie. The second is Kano, the criminal mercenary and traitor. However, something goes wrong with Kano's resurrection, or rather, something goes differently than planned. Because Kano is already so fundamentally and irredeemably corrupt as a human being, Quan Chi's magic cannot take hold of his soul in the same way it can with others. Quan Chi can resurrect Kano's body, but he cannot corrupt his soul further or bind him to outworlds the way he did with Kung Lao. Kano wakes up as his usual self, selfish, violent, and loyal to absolutely no one. This detail becomes enormously important later in the film. Now the story moves to Earthrealm. Lord Raiden, the Thunder God and eternal protector of Earthrealm, is in a state of serious concern. The 10th tournament is approaching, and Earthrealm needs 5 champions to represent it. Raiden currently has 4: Sonya Blade, the driven and capable Special Forces soldier; Liu Kang, the disciplined martial arts champion who has carried the burden of being Earthrealm's greatest fighter; Jax Briggs, Sonya's partner and an extraordinarily powerful brawler; and Cole Young, the protagonist of the first film who was revealed to be a descendant of Hanzo Hasashi. 4 fighters is not enough. They need a 5th champion, and Raiden has someone very specific in mind. Raiden and Sonya travel to Earthrealm, specifically, to a sad and unglamorous corner of it, where they find Johnny Cage. Johnny is a former Hollywood action star whose career has completely collapsed. He was once a genuine celebrity, a martial arts film icon who built his fame on very real fighting skills wrapped in a flashy and arrogant persona. But now he is washed up, struggling to even draw an audience at fan conventions, drinking in parking lots, and clearly a man who has lost his sense of purpose. Carl Urban plays this version of Cage with tremendous self-aware wit. Johnny knows exactly how far he has fallen, and he uses humor and bravado to avoid confronting how much it hurts. When Raiden and Sonya approach him and explain that he has been chosen to represent Earthrealm in a supernatural fighting tournament where the fate of the world is literally at stake, Johnny's reaction is exactly what you would expect: disbelief, sarcasm. Tadanobu Asano, who plays Lord Raiden, was born on November 27, 1973, in Yokohama, Japan. He is one of Japan's most celebrated and internationally recognized actors, with a career spanning decades and an extraordinary range that has taken him from intimate independent Japanese cinema to major Hollywood blockbusters. He first gained international attention through his work in Japanese art house films and later through his role as Hogun in the Marvel Cinematic Universe's Thor films, where he appeared across 3 entries in the franchise. He is widely regarded in Japan as one of the defining screen actors of his generation, and his performance as Raiden brings a quiet authority and divine gravity to the role that grounds the supernatural elements of the story in something genuinely weighty. Shin Han, who plays the scheming and endlessly manipulative Shang Tsung, was born on November 27, 1969, in Singapore. He is one of Singapore's most prominent international actors, having built a career that has taken him from the Singapore stage and screen into major Hollywood productions including The Dark Knight, in which he played Lau, the Hong Kong businessman whose transfer of funds sets a key portion of the plot in motion. He has appeared in numerous high-profile international productions over the years, and his portrayal of Shang Tsung across both Mortal Kombat films brings a cold, calculating intelligence to a villain who is always thinking 3 moves ahead of everyone else in the room. Damon Harriman, who plays Quan Chi in this film, was born on March 25, 1972, in Adelaide, South Australia. He is one of Australia's most versatile and acclaimed character actors, best known internationally for his role as Dewey Crow in the FX crime drama Justified, which ran from 2010 to 2015. He also played Charles Manson in 2 separate major productions in the same year, Quentin Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood and the Netflix series Mindhunter, a remarkable coincidence that became one of the more surreal footnotes of recent Hollywood history. Desmond Chiam, who plays King Jared of Enia, was born on July 30, 1988, in Singapore, though he later moved to Australia, where he built the early part of his professional career. He is perhaps best known for his roles in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, having appeared in The Falcon and the Winter Soldier as a member of the Flag Smashers, a role that introduced him to the enormous global audience of the MCU. Anna Thursday Nguyen, who plays Queen Sindel, is a Vietnamese-Australian actress who has built her career primarily in Australia across film and television. Her portrayal of Sindel, transformed from a noble queen into a corrupted servant of our world through Quan Chi's dark magic, required her to embody both the tragedy of what the character once was and the terror of what she has become, and she navigated that dual nature with compelling commitment. And that is the complete life story of every major actor in Mortal Kombat 2, real people with extraordinary journeys, who came together from New Zealand, Germany, Canada, Japan, England, Australia, Indonesia, Singapore, and the United States to make one of the biggest action films of 2026. Here is the full YouTube script on the budget, making and funny scenes on set of Mortal Kombat 2, written in complete, clean paragraphs. Welcome back to the channel, and today we are going behind the camera entirely. We are leaving our world, stepping off the tournament stage, and walking straight onto the Gold Coast set of Mortal Kombat 2 to talk about two things: how this movie was actually built from a financial and production standpoint, and what it was genuinely like when this wild, enormous cast of fighters, action stars, and comedians were all crammed together in Queensland, Australia, trying to make one of the biggest action films of 2026. Because there is a story here that is just as entertaining as anything happening on screen. So let us get into every detail. To understand the budget of Mortal Kombat 2 properly, you first need to understand where the franchise stood after the 2021 original. The first Mortal Kombat reboot was made on a budget of $55 million and released in April 2021, a moment in time that could not have been more complicated. The world was still locked into a pandemic marketplace, theaters were operating at reduced capacity in many parts of the world, and Warner Brothers had made the extraordinary and controversial decision to release the film simultaneously on their HBO Max streaming platform on the same day it hit cinemas. For a film banking on theatrical bloodshed and fan excitement, that dual-release strategy significantly complicated its box office picture. Despite all of those headwinds, the film still managed to gross $84.4 million worldwide, a result that, when you factor in the impossible circumstances, was genuinely respectable and gave the studio enough confidence to greenlight a sequel. The reaction from fans was strong, the demand for the tournament to actually happen was overwhelming, and New Line Cinema made the decision in January 2022 to move forward. By the time Mortal Kombat 2 was formally greenlit and production planning began in earnest, the studio had made a deliberate and meaningful decision. This film would cost significantly more than its predecessor. The production budget was set at $80 million, a $25 million increase from the original. That gap between $55 million and $80 million is not just a number. Every single dollar of that increase represents a specific creative ambition that the first film simply could not afford. The 2021 original had been criticized in some quarters for feeling a little contained, for not fully realizing the richness of the Mortal Kombat universe in terms of realm building, character variety, and the sheer visual spectacle that franchise fans had always demanded. With $80 million at their disposal, director Simon McQuoid and his team had the resources to fix all of that. The single biggest financial decision the studio made in building this sequel was the casting of Karl Urban as Johnny Cage. Urban is not a cheap actor. He is a proven global box office name with a franchise pedigree that includes The Lord of the Rings, Star Trek, Dredd, and most importantly The Boys, one of the most watched streaming series in the world. Bringing him into the Mortal Kombat universe represented the largest individual casting investment the franchise had ever made, and it was a bet that the studio believed would immediately elevate the film's commercial profile and attract a broader audience beyond the core gaming fanbase. The gamble was justified, as Urban's name and performance became the single most talked about element of the film across every review and every promotional interview in the months leading up to release. Beyond Karl Urban, the expanded cast itself represented a substantial portion of the increased budget. Returning stars from the first film, Jessica McNamee, Josh Lawson, Ludi Lin, Mehcad Brooks, Joe Taslim, and Hiroyuki Sanada, all had to be renegotiated for the sequel, and any actor coming back to a sequel of a commercially successful franchise naturally commands a higher rate than they received for the first entry. On top of that, the studio was bringing in several entirely new cast members: Adeline Rudolph as Kitana, Toddy Gabriel as Jade, Martin Ford as Shao Kahn, Desmond Chiam as King Jared, Anna Thursday Nguyen as Sindel, and Damon Harriman as Quan Chi. Each of these additions required costume design, character-specific fight training, and dedicated production resources. Assembling an ensemble of this size with this many distinct characters simultaneously on a single production is an extraordinarily complex logistical and financial undertaking. The visual effects budget was where a very significant portion of the increased spending went, and for entirely understandable reasons. The signature fatality sequences that define the franchise demand an extraordinary level of frame-by-frame VFX work. Every bone-shattering, body-splitting, impossibly brutal kill needs to be executed with practical effects, digital doubles, physics-based blood simulation, and creature design that all have to work in seamless combination with what the actors and stunt teams are doing physically on set. The expanded roster of fighters from the game's mythology, Shao Kahn in his towering armored form, Noob Saibot's shadow clone mechanics, Jade's blade work, Kitana's bladed fans, and the Netherrealm environments, all demanded extensive digital work from multiple VFX vendors working simultaneously. The Netherrealm sequences in particular, which required the creation of an entirely distinct visual world of shadow and darkness, were among the most VFX-intensive sections of the film, and consumed a considerable portion of the effects budget. Set construction and practical design was another major area of expenditure. The production chose to build as much as possible practically at Village Roadshow Studios in Gold Coast rather than relying exclusively on green screen and digital environments. This was a creative decision as much as a financial one. Director Simon Macwood and his team believed strongly that the actors needed real physical environments to react to in order to make the tournament sequences feel grounded and genuinely threatening. The arena sets, the Edenian Palace environments, the temple interiors, and the tournament stages were all constructed at enormous scale on the Gold Coast stages, requiring weeks of work from production designers, construction crews, and prop makers before a single frame of film was ever shot. Fight training and stunt coordination represented another significant budget line. The physical preparation for this film was on a different level than almost any other non-martial arts franchise Hollywood was producing at the time. The production employed a team of dedicated fight choreographers whose sole job was to develop custom fighting styles for every character that were both game-accurate and cinematically exciting. Every member of the principal cast underwent intensive martial arts training weeks, and in some cases months before principal photography began. Stunt doubles, stunt coordinators, safety riggers, and wire work specialists all had to be hired, housed, and paid for the duration of the production. And with a cast that included Joe Taslim, a former national judo champion, Carl Urban, Martin Ford, Max Wong, and Ludi Lin all performing at extremely high levels of physical ability, the coordination required to ensure everyone was safe while also delivering genuinely spectacular action was an enormous and ongoing operational challenge. The Australia-based production structure also brought specific costs. Village Roadshow Studios on the Gold Coast is a world-class facility, but renting those stages at the scale required for a production of this size for a period of months is a substantial expense. The production benefited from Screen Queensland's generous incentives for offshore productions, which helped offset some of the location costs significantly. The Australian government has made attracting major international film productions a priority, and the financial support available to a production like Mortal Kombat 2 through those incentive programs is meaningful. Queensland's subtropical landscape also gave the production access to genuinely diverse natural terrain for exterior shoots without having to travel far from the studio base, which saved both time and money that would otherwise have been spent on international location work. Then came the SAG-AFTRA strike, which turned what was meant to be a relatively controlled production into something considerably more complicated. Principal photography had started on June 22, 2023, and the production was only a matter of weeks into filming when the SAG-AFTRA strike officially began in July 2023. As an American studio production shooting with American Union actors, Mortal Kombat 2 had no choice but to shut down. The Australian Actors Union issued guidance confirming that offshore productions like Mortal Kombat 2 would stand down during the strike, and the entire production went dark. Stages that had been built and dressed sat waiting. A crew of hundreds was sent home. The financial implications of a production halt of that kind are significant. Stages still had to be maintained and kept ready, crew had to be managed, and the timeline of the entire production had to be rebuilt from the ground up once the strike finally ended. The strike concluded in November 2023, and production resumed that same month. The cast returned to the Gold Coast and filming continued through the Queensland summer into January 2024, when the production finally wrapped. From those final days in January 2024 through to the film's theatrical release on May 8, 2026, the post-production journey took well over 2 years, an unusually long post-production period that reflects the sheer volume and complexity of the effects work that needed to be completed, the editing process of shaping the film into its final 2-hour cut, and the series of release date changes the film navigated before landing on its ultimate May 2026 slot. Now let us talk about what was actually happening on that Gold Coast set when the cameras were not rolling, because the behind-the-scenes story of this production is genuinely one of the most entertaining stories in Hollywood this decade. This cast was extraordinary in terms of talent, physical ability, and cultural diversity, but it also turned out to be an absolute goldmine of personality, humor, and chaos that the cast have spoken about with enormous affection in every single interview they have done since the film was completed. Karl Urban's first day on set has already become the stuff of genuine production legend. Urban arrived at the Gold Coast airport from New Zealand, fresh off his commitments to The Boys' 4th season, where he had spent months playing the deeply bleak and cancer-ridden Billy Butcher. He landed, collected his luggage, fully expected to be taken to a hotel to decompress, and was instead immediately driven straight to the stunt rehearsal space. There was no hotel visit. There was no settling in. His bags went in one direction and Karl Urban went directly into a room full of stunt coordinators and fight choreographers. He told the story in detail during the press junket, and the look on his face as he recounted it suggested the memory still produced a very particular mixture of amusement and mild horror. The reason for this urgent greeting was Joe Taslim. The crew had been waiting for Urban's arrival specifically to begin the fight coordination work between Johnny Cage and Bi-Han, and they had a very simple message for the New Zealander upon his arrival. The man you are going to be working with operates at a level that you need to start catching up to immediately. Urban described Taslim as an absolute weapon, noting that during the filming of the first Mortal Kombat, the camera operators had literally been forced to ask Taslim to slow his movements down because the camera could not physically capture his hands at the speed he was naturally moving. This is not a story about special effects or wire work. This is a story about a man who is so extraordinarily fast that filmmaking technology struggled to keep up with him in real time. Josh Lawson, who returned as Kano after what most fans had assumed was a definitive and permanent death in the first film, described his discovery that he was coming back to the franchise in the most perfectly Kano way imaginable. He genuinely had no idea he was returning. When he had finished the first film and filmed Kano's death scene, he had assumed quite reasonably that a character who was explicitly and graphically killed was finished. When the sequel's development began and he received the call telling him Kano was being brought back, his reaction was one of complete and delighted bafflement. He described it in interviews as someone putting another quarter in the machine for a character he thought had played his final round. His preparation for returning to Kano was, by his own account, entirely focused on one thing above all others: the voice. Lawson has spoken openly about how Kano's character is entirely built in the mouth, in the rhythm of the profanity, in the particular way every single line is delivered with the energy of a man who has no respect for anyone or anything in any realm. He described his vocal warm-up regimen for Kano as essentially practicing saying as many expletives as possible and as many different configurations as possible, treating it with the same seriousness a Shakespearean actor might bring to verse work. The dynamic between Carl Urban and Josh Lawson on set became one of the production's great running entertainments. These are two actors who are both naturally funny, both deeply comfortable with improvisation, and both clearly delighted to be playing characters who are essentially the comedic heart of what is fundamentally a very violent and serious-toned franchise. Crew members present during the filming of the Johnny Cage and Kano scenes in the Netherrealm have described those days on set as some of the most physically exhausting and simultaneously most hilarious shooting days of the entire production. Urban and Lawson were apparently incapable of getting through a single setup without one of them breaking character, usually by improvising additional Cage or Kano dialogue that was not in the script but was absolutely perfectly in character, which would then make the other one break completely, which would then cause the crew to break, and then everyone would have to reassemble and try again from the beginning. Martin Ford's presence on the production created its own entirely unique energy, and it was an energy built almost entirely on the extraordinary contrast between how terrifying he looks and how warm and gentle he apparently is in real life. Ford stands 6 feet 8 inches tall. He weighs in excess of 315 pounds of essentially pure muscle. In costume as Shao Kahn, with the full armored suit and the iconic mask, he is genuinely one of the most visually overwhelming human beings ever placed on a film set. The costume team who built Shao Kahn's armor had to construct it essentially from scratch around Ford's dimensions, because there is no standard template in any costume department stock that remotely approximates what is required to clothe this particular man. The process of getting Ford into the full Shao Kahn outfit each day was reportedly one of the longer makeup and costume calls on the production, requiring a dedicated team working on him for a substantial period before he could walk onto the set. And yet every account from cast members who worked alongside him describes a man who is unfailingly kind, genuinely enthusiastic, warm to everyone from the leads to the background artists, and possessed of a quiet sense of humor about the sheer absurdity of his own physical presence. The story that circulated most widely during production was that Ford would occasionally sit in the Shao Kahn throne during breaks between setups, still in full costume, this enormous, armored, maskless emperor perched on his war throne eating a sandwich and chatting cheerfully with crew members, an image that cast members described as simultaneously hilarious and deeply surreal. The friendship between Adeline Rudolph and Tati Gabrielle was one of the great joys of the production, and it was built on a foundation of a relationship that already existed from their time together on Chilling Adventures of Sabrina. These two women arrived on the Mortal Kombat 2 set having already developed the trust and the shorthand that takes most casts months of working together to build, and that pre-existing bond translated into an on-set dynamic that everyone around them has described as infectious. They trained together, they laughed together, and they apparently drove the fight choreographers to occasional distraction by turning every break in training into an extended social occasion that required the coordinators to gently, but repeatedly redirect their attention back to the matter of learning to fight convincingly with bladed weapons. The bladed fan choreography that Rudolph had to develop for Kitana was particularly demanding. These are not standard martial arts weapons, and learning to move with them in a way that looked natural, powerful, and authentic to the character required weeks of specific dedicated practice. Rudolph has spoken about how strange and then eventually wonderful it felt to spend so many weeks of her life becoming genuinely comfortable handling these extraordinary weapons, to the point where picking them up started to feel second nature. Hiroyuki Sanada brought a presence to the set that everyone else described in the same way, quietly extraordinary. This is a man who has been a professional actor since he was 5 years old. He has been training in martial arts disciplines for over 60 years. He has appeared in major productions in Japan, Hollywood, and everywhere in between for his entire adult life. When Sanada walked onto the Gold Coast set, there was an immediate and instinctive recognition from every other professional in the room that this was someone operating at a completely different altitude of experience. And yet, by all accounts, Sanada wore none of that history as authority or distance. He was immediately approachable, warm, and deeply collaborative. Younger cast members who were in their first or second major Hollywood productions have described watching Sanada work as one of the most educational experiences of their professional lives. Watching how he manages his energy between takes, how he prepares for emotionally complex moments, how he moves through a physical sequence, all of it a masterclass in a discipline he has been refining for 6 decades. Joe Taslim's transformation from Sub-Zero in the first film to Noob Saibot in this one was one of the production's most fascinating creative processes to observe up close. Taslim spent years building the cold, precise, controlled physicality of Bai Han as Sub-Zero, a character defined by restraint and technical perfection. Noob Saibot required something completely different. The shadow clone mechanic, whereby Han's transformed self can split into 2 dark figures and attack from multiple directions simultaneously, demanded an entirely new physical language that Taslim and the fight coordinators had to develop from nothing. Taslim has described the challenge of this as one of the most interesting physical problems he has ever had to solve on a film. How do you embody a character whose defining power is the ability to be in 2 places at once? The answer involved months of choreography development, wire work, and a level of coordination with his stunt double and the VFX team that was unlike anything he had experienced before. The Gold Coast premiere of the film in early May 2026, a homecoming event for a production that was made there, gave the cast one final chance to be all together in the place where the film was born. And the stories that came out of that night summarize perfectly the tone that had defined the entire production. Josh Lawson, when asked to pitch a Kano spin-off film title for the audience, immediately launched into an improvised session of increasingly ridiculous ideas that had the crowd in absolute stitches. He started with Kano, actually, a romantic comedy pitch, before progressing through 12 years of Kano and eventually landing on I Know What Kano Did Last Summer, which was agreed by all present to be alarmingly appropriate given the character's complete moral absence. C.J. Bloomfield, who played Baraka, contributed perhaps the evening's most unexpectedly wholesome concept, a slice-of-life spin-off in which the terrifying blade-armed Tarkatan warrior attempts to live peacefully in Earthrealm, starting a butcher shop and simply trying to be a normal person. Bloomfield described it with complete sincerity and genuine enthusiasm as the character's journey toward humanity, which was somehow simultaneously the funniest and most touching pitch of the night. Desmond Chiam, who plays King Jared, shared that his entire introduction to the Mortal Kombat franchise came not through the games themselves but through playing with his cousins in Singapore over Xbox Live, using the game as a way to maintain family connections across distance. A detail that turned a story about a violent fighting game into something genuinely touching. On a Thursday, Gwyn, who plays Queen Sindel, admitted that her fighting game journey actually started not with Mortal Kombat but with Tekken, which she had been playing since she was 8 years old, an admission that was met with the kind of delighted outrage that only a room full of franchise devotees could produce. Martin Ford posted an Instagram video from the wrap party in January 2024 in which he reflected on the experience of the entire production with characteristic warmth and directness. He had arrived on the Gold Coast as a newcomer to this cast, a bodybuilder and actor who had never been part of anything at this scale before. He left describing the experience as one of the most meaningful of his professional life, writing that the cast had turned up as strangers and departed as a family. For a man who spends the entire film as the most terrifying villain imaginable, it is perhaps the single most wholesome behind-the-scenes detail the entire production generated. And Ed Boon, the co-creator of the entire franchise, the man who built Mortal Kombat from the ground up in 1992, a man who has been making these games for over 3 decades, showed up on the Gold Coast set to film his cameo as a bartender who serves Johnny Cage a drink at an Earthrealm bar, deadpanning to Karl Urban's character that he expected him to be normally a little more animated. The crew were not told about the cameo in advance, and when Boone arrived on set and it became clear who he was and what he was doing there, the reaction from cast and crew alike was reportedly one of the purest moments of collective joy the entire production experienced. This is the man who made all of this possible, the designer, the creator, the person whose imagination conjured every character in that room, and there he was, standing behind a bar on a soundstage in Queensland, delivering a perfectly dry line to Karl Urban with complete composure. That is the full story of how Mortal Kombat 2 was built, financed, constructed, disrupted, resumed, and brought to life by a cast that turned a brutal interdimensional fighting tournament into one of the warmest and funniest productions of recent Hollywood memory. To understand why Mortal Kombat 2 matters culturally, you have to go back to where the entire franchise began. And it begins not in Hollywood, not in a comic book, not in a novel, but in an arcade cabinet in 1992. The original Mortal Kombat video game was created by Ed Boon and John Tobias at Midway Games and released to arcades in October 1992. The game arrived at a very particular moment in American popular culture, a moment when the fighting game genre had already been electrified by the success of Capcom's Street Fighter II, which had demonstrated to the entire entertainment industry that competitive one-on-one fighting games could become genuine cultural phenomena. But where Street Fighter II operated within a relatively cartoonish visual language, Mortal Kombat did something that immediately separated it from everything else in the genre. It used digitized photography of real human actors rather than hand-drawn animation, giving the characters an appearance of genuine human physicality that was unlike anything audiences had ever seen in a video game before. The result was a game that looked disturbingly real by the standards of 1992, and when it introduced its signature fatality system, in which the winning player could perform an elaborate and graphically violent finishing move on their defeated opponent, it triggered a cultural shockwave that extended far beyond the gaming community. The fatalities were not subtle. They were designed to be shocking, visceral, and spectacular, the kind of content that immediately divided opinion between people who found them thrillingly transgressive and people who found them genuinely disturbing. Spines were ripped from bodies. Heads were torn off. Combatants were burned, frozen, and dismembered in ways that had simply never appeared in a mainstream entertainment product aimed at a broad consumer market. Parents were alarmed. Newspapers ran coverage. Politicians began to notice. And Mortal Kombat became one of the most talked about entertainment products in America almost overnight, not just because it was a remarkable game, but because it represented something genuinely new and genuinely confrontational in the cultural landscape. The political consequences of Mortal Kombat's arrival were real and lasting and cannot be overstated when discussing the cultural significance of this franchise. In 1993, Senator Joe Lieberman of Connecticut and Senator Herb Kohl of Wisconsin convened congressional hearings specifically examining violence in video games, with Mortal Kombat at the very center of the discussion. These were not symbolic hearings. They were serious legislative proceedings in which the gaming industry was called before the United States Senate and challenged to explain why products depicting the kind of content Mortal Kombat contained were being sold to children. The hearings examined Mortal Kombat alongside other violent games of the period, and the message from the Senate to the gaming industry was unambiguous: regulate yourselves, or the government will regulate you. The gaming industry's response to this pressure was the creation of the Entertainment Software Rating Board in 1994, known universally today as the ESRB, the rating system that assigns age-appropriate labels to every video game sold in the United States. The ESRB, which still functions today and whose rating labels appear on every game box and digital storefront in America, exists in its current form in very large part because of Mortal Kombat. The franchise did not just entertain people. It changed the regulatory architecture of an entire industry and created a framework for content labeling that has been in operation for over 30 years. That is a level of cultural impact that very few entertainment products of any kind have achieved. The mythological architecture of Mortal Kombat 2, the tournament structure, the cosmology of realms, the divine protectors, the forces of darkness, draws on a rich and genuinely ancient set of sources that the film's creators have woven together into something that is simultaneously deeply familiar and distinctly its own creation. The most foundational influence on the entire Mortal Kombat universe is the Chinese martial arts film tradition, specifically the rich genre of wuxia cinema that has been producing stories of extraordinary warriors, mystical powers, and cosmic battles between good and evil for centuries in Chinese storytelling. Wuxia, which translates roughly as martial heroes, is one of the oldest and most beloved narrative genres in Chinese literary and cinematic history, and its DNA runs through every aspect of Mortal Kombat's design. The concept of warriors who transcend ordinary human limitation through discipline, training, and the cultivation of internal power is wuxia at its most fundamental, and it is the core premise of almost every character and storyline in the Mortal Kombat universe. The specific tournament structure around which Mortal Kombat 2 is built has deep roots in Chinese mythology and martial tradition. The idea of a great tournament in which representatives of different realms or kingdoms compete to determine the fate of their people is not an invention of Ed Boon and John Tobias. It is a narrative framework that appears across centuries of Chinese storytelling, from classical literature to Beijing opera to 20th century martial arts films. The tournament as a crucible of fate, where individual combat serves as a proxy for the destiny of entire civilizations, is a concept that resonates across multiple Asian cultures and traditions. And Mortal Kombat absorbed it so deeply and expressed it so vividly that it introduced this fundamentally Asian storytelling framework to a global mainstream audience in a way that no other Western entertainment product had quite managed before. The character of Lord Raiden, the Thunder God and eternal protector of Earthrealm, is one of the most explicitly and deliberately mythological figures in the franchise. Raiden draws directly on Raijin, the Japanese god of thunder and storms, who is one of the oldest and most significant deities in the Shinto tradition. Raijin appears throughout Japanese art and mythology spanning over 1,000 years of cultural history. He is depicted in ancient temple paintings, in kabuki theater, in traditional sculpture, and in innumerable works of Japanese folk art as a powerful and fearsome divine figure associated with the storms and the heavens. The Mortal Kombat franchise's Raiden preserves the essential character of the original mythological figure, the connection to lightning, the divine authority, the role as protector of the world, while translating him into a new storytelling context for a global audience. Tadanobu Asano, who plays Raiden in the film, brings to the character a quiet and ancient authority that feels entirely appropriate for a being drawn from a mythological tradition that is over 1,000 years old. The character of Scorpion, Hanzo Hasashi, and his counterpart Sub-Zero, Bi-Han, are built on the real historical tradition of the ninja, which is one of the most mythologized and misunderstood elements of Japanese history in Western popular culture. The real ninja, or shinobi, were covert agents and mercenaries who operated in feudal Japan primarily during the Sengoku period, the era of civil wars and political instability that ran roughly from the mid-15th to early 17th centuries. The Shirai Ryu and Lin-Kei clans that appear in Mortal Kombat are directly inspired by the real clan-based organizational structure that characterized historical ninja culture in Japan, where families and groups trained together in the arts of espionage, infiltration, and combat and maintained fierce, sometimes violent rivalries with competing clans over territory, prestige, and employment. The film's opening sequence, set in 1617 Japan, places the Hasashi massacre in an entirely historically accurate context. This is the late Sengoku period, a time of genuine political consolidation in Japan under the Tokugawa shogunate, exactly the kind of historical moment when the old warrior clans were losing power and finding themselves in desperate conflict over survival. The detail is not accidental. The creators of Mortal Kombat researched the historical context of Japanese martial culture carefully, and the result is a backstory for Scorpion that has genuine historical roots beneath its supernatural surface. The film's cosmology of multiple interconnected realms, Earthrealm, our world, Enea, the Netherrealm, reflects a spiritual and philosophical architecture that draws on genuinely ancient human traditions of imagining the structure of existence. The idea of multiple layered worlds or realms connected to each other through barriers that can be crossed by beings of sufficient power appears in Hindu cosmology, Norse mythology, ancient Chinese religious thought, and numerous indigenous spiritual traditions across the world. In Hindu cosmology particularly, which has had an enormous influence on the martial arts traditions of Southeast and East Asia that flows so directly into Mortal Kombat's DNA, the universe is understood as a vast collection of interconnected realms of existence, each governed by its own rules and populated by its own kinds of beings, with the human world existing in relationship to divine, demonic, and supernatural realms that both threaten and support it. The Mortal Kombat franchise translated this ancient cosmological framework into a form that could be understood and engaged with by a global mainstream audience, and the film realizes that framework in visual terms, particularly in the Netherrealm sequences, with a genuine mythological weight that elevates it above a simple fantasy setting. The Kingdom of Enea, which serves as the emotional foundation of Mortal Kombat 2 through Kitana's story, is the film's most explicit engagement with the mythology of lost homelands and stolen identities, themes that resonate across the histories of colonized and conquered peoples in a way that gives the story an unexpected depth. Enea is a paradise realm that was conquered and absorbed by our world through a tournament victory, its king murdered, its queen taken, and its royal heir raised by the conqueror as his own daughter. This is not just a fantasy premise. It is a template for a form of historical trauma that has been experienced by real peoples and real nations throughout human history. The experience of having your civilization conquered, your identity erased, and your children raised to serve the interests of the people who destroyed everything you were is one of the most recurring and devastating forms of historical violence, and the Mortal Kombat franchise is engaging with that template, consciously or not, through every aspect of Kitana's arc. The casting choices made for Mortal Kombat 2 carry enormous cultural significance that cannot be separated from the film's broader meaning. Hiroyuki Sanada, who plays Scorpion, is one of the most accomplished and respected actors in Japanese cinema, a man who trained in kabuki theater from childhood, who has spent over 60 years mastering the physical and dramatic traditions of his culture, and who now brings all of that depth to a Hollywood blockbuster playing a character drawn directly from Japanese martial and spiritual mythology. His presence in this film is not just a casting choice, it is a statement about the value and importance of authentic cultural representation in storytelling that draws on cultural traditions for its mythology. The same is true of Joe Taslim, the Indonesian actor whose career was built on the martial arts traditions of his own cultural heritage before he became internationally recognized through The Raid. The decision to cast Asian and Asian-descended performers in the roles drawn from Asian mythology was a deliberate one, and it makes the film more honest and more meaningful than the kind of casting choices Hollywood made in earlier decades when stories set in Asian contexts were routinely given to Western actors. Carl Urban's Johnny Cage carries his own set of cultural references that are worth understanding in historical context. Johnny Cage is, at the most fundamental level, a satire of a very specific American cultural type, the Hollywood action star of the late 20th century, a persona built on masculine performance, physical spectacle, and a carefully constructed public image of invincibility. The franchise created this character in 1992 as a direct parody of Jean-Claude Van Damme, the Belgian martial arts film star who was one of the biggest action movie icons of the period. Van Damme was actually approached to play a character in the original Mortal Kombat game before negotiations fell apart, and the game's creators responded by building Johnny Cage as a fictional version of the Van Damme archetype, the flashy, arrogant, martial arts-trained Hollywood star who translates real fighting skill into cinematic entertainment. Urban's performance in the 2026 film honors and updates this satirical foundation by making Johnny a figure who represents a generation of action stars who built their identities on a particular kind of masculine invincibility, and now finds himself in a world that has moved on. The convention scene in the opening of the film, where Johnny sits in a hotel ballroom signing autographs for a distressingly sparse crowd of fans, is as much a commentary on the shifting cultural landscape of celebrity, fame, and the action star archetype as it is a character introduction. Urban has spoken in interviews about how he thought carefully about the action heroes of the 1980s and early 1990s: Eastwood, Stallone, Ford, Van Damme, Jackie Chan, Bruce Lee, as the cultural raw material from which Johnny Cage was assembled, a man who consumed all of those influences and turned them into a career that is now fading. The film's engagement with martial arts culture more broadly is one of its most culturally significant aspects. Martial arts in their traditional forms are not simply fighting systems. They are philosophical and spiritual disciplines with deep roots in the religious and ethical traditions of the cultures that produced them. Chinese martial arts, or wushu, developed over thousands of years in relationship to Taoist and Buddhist philosophy, with the idea that physical discipline is inseparable from spiritual and moral development at the heart of the practice. Japanese martial arts traditions, judo, kendo, ninjutsu, and countless others, developed within a philosophical framework shaped by Shinto spiritual values and the ethical code of Bushido, the way of the warrior, which placed enormous weight on concepts of honor, duty, and self-sacrifice. Korean martial arts like Taekwondo similarly developed in relationship to philosophical and spiritual values that gave the practice a meaning far beyond simple combat effectiveness. Indonesian martial arts traditions, embodied in the career of Joe Taslim, are part of a rich and ancient fighting culture that reflects the particular cultural history of the Indonesian archipelago. Mortal Kombat 2, perhaps more than any previous entry in this franchise's film history, actually honors these traditions in a meaningful way. The fight choreography was designed not just to look spectacular but to reflect the distinct martial identities of each character: Liu Kang's fluid Chinese kung fu style, Scorpion's fierce and spiritual ninjutsu, Jax's powerful and direct Western boxing and grappling, Sonya's military combat training, Kitana's graceful and blade-centered Edenian fighting tradition. Each fighting style in the film is a cultural statement as much as a visual choice, and the level of genuine martial arts training that the principal cast underwent before filming began means that what appears on screen is not a simulation of these traditions but an actual expression of them, performed by people who spent months developing real competence in real disciplines. The film's treatment of female power and female agency deserves particular attention as a culturally significant dimension of what Mortal Kombat 2 is doing. Kitana's arc, from adopted daughter of a conqueror to queen of a liberated realm, is one of the most complete and satisfying stories of female agency in recent blockbuster cinema. She is not a love interest, not a supporting character whose purpose is to illuminate a male protagonist's journey. She is the film's moral and emotional center, the character whose personal history gives the story its deepest meaning, and the character who ultimately delivers the definitive killing blow to the central villain. Sonya Blade continues the tradition established in the 2021 film of presenting a female fighter who is not defined by her gender but by her capability, her intelligence, and her military professionalism. Jade's transformation from loyal servant of our world to ally of Earthrealm is another female arc defined by moral courage and independent decision-making. The 2026 film takes the franchise's long-standing tradition of featuring powerful female fighters, a tradition that goes back to the original 1992 game, and elevates it into something that feels genuinely progressive and culturally meaningful within the context of modern blockbuster cinema. The film's release in the specific cultural context of 2026 is also worth understanding. Video game adaptations have undergone a complete and dramatic rehabilitation in the eyes of both critics and audiences over the preceding several years. For decades, the video game movie was one of the most reliably derided categories in Hollywood, a genre so consistently disappointing that it became a byword for creative failure. Super Mario Bros. In 1993 was a catastrophe. Street Fighter in 1994 was a disaster. The original Mortal Kombat in 1995 was entertaining but ultimately disposable. A long series of failed adaptations through the 2000s and 2010s reinforced the idea that video game stories simply did not translate to film. And then, slowly and then suddenly, everything changed. Detective Pikachu proved the concept could work with the right creative approach. Sonic the Hedgehog became a genuine family hit. The Last of Us television adaptation became one of the most critically acclaimed shows of recent years, demonstrating that video game narrative could be the foundation for storytelling of genuine depth and emotional resonance. A Minecraft movie grossed close to $1 billion in 2025. By the time Mortal Kombat 2 arrived in May 2026, it was entering a cultural environment that had completely reversed its assumptions about what video game adaptations could be and what audiences would accept from them. The film benefited from this cultural shift enormously, arriving as part of a genuine renaissance of the genre rather than another entry in a history of failure. The legacy of the 1995 Mortal Kombat film also provides important cultural context for understanding what the 2026 film is building on and building away from. The 1995 Paul W. S. Anderson film, which starred Robin Shou, Lyndon Ashby, and Cary Hiroyuki Tagawa, was a product of its specific cultural moment, the mid-1990s martial arts action film tradition, the post-Street Fighter video game adaptation gold rush, and a Hollywood that was deeply uncertain about how to adapt gaming properties for a mainstream audience. The film became a genuine cult phenomenon, not because it was particularly sophisticated filmmaking, but because it captured the energy and the mythology of the game with enough enthusiasm and visual flair to create something genuinely fun. Its Techno Syndrome soundtrack became one of the most recognizable pieces of music from the entire decade. The tournament structure, the character dynamics, and the supernatural mythology were rendered on screen in a way that satisfied fans enough to make the film a commercial success. The 2026 film exists in creative dialogue with this legacy, honoring it enough to satisfy longtime fans who grew up with the 1995 original, while building something considerably more sophisticated, considerably more faithful to the source material's depth, and considerably more culturally thoughtful. The franchise's relationship to questions of cultural identity, representation, and the global entertainment marketplace has evolved dramatically across its 30-year history. The original 1992 game was created by two American designers but drew so heavily on Asian martial arts culture, Asian mythology, and Asian visual tradition that it was effectively a piece of Western popular culture built almost entirely on Asian cultural foundations. The question of whether and how that source material was being honored, appropriated, or distorted has followed the franchise through every iteration of its existence, and the 2026 film represents the most serious and thoughtful attempt yet to answer that question constructively. By casting Asian and Asian-descended performers in the roles drawn from Asian cultural traditions, by hiring fight choreographers with genuine martial arts expertise rather than simply action stunt coordinators, by taking seriously the mythological and spiritual dimensions of the characters' backstories, and by building a production that brought together performers from New Zealand, Japan, Indonesia, Canada, Germany, Australia, and the United States, the film makes an implicit argument that the global nature of its cast is the point, that a franchise built on the martial traditions of multiple Asian cultures is best served by a cast that reflects the genuine diversity of those traditions. When Martin Ford posted from the wrap party in January 2024 and described a cast that had arrived as strangers and left as family, he was describing something that goes beyond the normal bounds of a film production. He was describing what happens when people from genuinely different cultural backgrounds, different countries, different languages, different fighting traditions, different entertainment industries, spend months sharing something as physically and emotionally demanding as making this film, and emerge from that experience with a shared sense of purpose and belonging. The film that resulted from that experience carries that spirit in every scene, and it is one of the reasons that Mortal Kombat 2 feels, despite all its explosive violence and supernatural spectacle, like a film made by people who genuinely cared about what they were doing and why they were doing it. Mortal Kombat began in 1992 as a coin-operated machine in an arcade. It sparked a United States Senate hearing. It created an industry rating system that still operates today. It introduced a global mainstream audience to the mythological traditions of Asian martial culture. It built one of the most recognizable and enduring entertainment franchises of the last 3 decades. And in 2026, it arrived on the big screen in a form that honored all of that history while building something genuinely new, a film with cultural roots that stretch back centuries, performed by an ensemble that spans the globe, telling a story about identity, sacrifice, belonging, and the courage it takes to reclaim who you really are. That is not just a blockbuster. That is a cultural document. And it deserves to be understood as one. Here is the complete YouTube script on the irony and historical details of Mortal Kombat 2, written in full, clean paragraphs. Welcome back to the channel, and today we are going somewhere entirely different with Mortal Kombat 2. We are not talking about the fights, the fatalities, or even the cast. We are talking about irony, the deep, layered, sometimes hilarious, sometimes profound ironies woven into the very fabric of this film, and the franchise that produced it. And alongside those ironies, we are going to trace the full historical arc of one of the most consequential entertainment properties of the last 34 years, from a single arcade cabinet in 1992 all the way to a 2026 Hollywood blockbuster that carries decades of cultural history inside every frame. This is going to be a long one, and it deserves every single minute. So let us begin. The first and perhaps greatest irony of the entire Mortal Kombat story is one that sits at the very origin of the franchise and has never entirely gone away. Mortal Kombat, a game built almost entirely on the creative foundations of Asian martial arts cinema, Asian mythology, Japanese ninja culture, and Chinese fighting traditions, was created by 2 men from Chicago who were, by their own admission, drawing on a cultural heritage that was not their own. Ed Boon and John Tobias were American game developers working for Midway Games whose primary inspirations for the game's mythology, visual language, and fighting philosophy came from Hong Kong cinema, Shaw Brothers martial arts films, Bruce Lee movies, the mythology of the Japanese ninja, and Asian spiritual traditions. John Tobias has spoken about being deeply influenced by films like Big Trouble in Little China and the broader tradition of Hong Kong action cinema as he developed the game's narrative framework. The result was a product made in the American Midwest that was built almost entirely on the cultural DNA of East and Southeast Asia, and that product then became one of the most successful and recognizable entertainment exports in American history. The franchise that grew from that foundation has sold over 100 million copies worldwide and produced films that have grossed hundreds of millions of dollars globally. The deepest historical roots of Mortal Kombat are not in Chicago or Hollywood or any corner of the Western entertainment tradition. They are in ancient Chinese mythology, in the philosophical traditions of Japanese martial arts, in the spiritual cosmology of Hindu thought, and in the storytelling traditions of cultures that had been developing those ideas for centuries before a single frame of any Mortal Kombat game was ever designed. That is a genuinely remarkable thing to sit with. And the 2026 film, by casting Hiroyuki Sanada, Joe Taslim, Ludi Lin, Chin Han, and Tadanobu Asano in central roles drawn directly from those cultural traditions, makes an implicit acknowledgement of that history that the franchise had not always been willing to make so clearly before. The second great irony of Mortal Kombat's existence is the one that defines its entire political legacy, and it is one of the most perfectly constructed ironies in the history of the entertainment industry. In 1993, Senators Joe Lieberman and Herb Kohl convened congressional hearings in the United States Senate specifically to address the threat they believed Mortal Kombat represented to American youth. The game had been released in October 1992, and within a year it had become the center of a genuine moral panic, the kind of widespread public anxiety about a new entertainment medium that has accompanied every generation of new technology. From dime novels in the 19th century to comic books in the 1950s to rock and roll in the same decade to rap music in the 1980s and beyond. The hearings, which were broadcast and reported on widely, put Midway's creation at the very center of a national conversation about violence, children, and the responsibilities of the entertainment industry. Senators showed footage of the fatalities in congressional chambers. Public health officials testified about the potential psychological impact of violent media on developing minds. The entire apparatus of American legislative concern was aimed squarely at this arcade cabinet from Chicago. The irony is this, and it is a beautiful one. The congressional hearings that were designed to damage, restrict, or potentially destroy Mortal Kombat did not do any of those things. What they did instead was give the game the most valuable and the most expensive thing any entertainment product can possibly receive: massive, sustained, nationally televised free publicity. Every American who watched the news coverage of those hearings and had never previously heard of Mortal Kombat now knew exactly what it was, what it contained, and where to find it. The outrage machine that Senator Lieberman set in motion became, in effect, the most powerful marketing campaign the game's creators could never have afforded or imagined. Arcade revenue from Mortal Kombat in 1993, the year of the hearings, exceeded $300,000 from cabinet rentals alone, which was an unprecedented figure for the period. The more people were told that Mortal Kombat was dangerous and transgressive, the more desperately they wanted to experience it for themselves. This is a pattern that repeats throughout the history of censorship and moral panic. The attempt to suppress something almost invariably makes it more desirable, but rarely has it played out with such perfect and quantifiable irony as it did with Mortal Kombat. The outcome of those hearings produced the second dimension of this irony. The gaming industry, facing the very real threat of government-imposed censorship if it did not regulate itself, created the Entertainment Software Rating Board, the ESRB, in 1994. The ESRB assigned rating labels to video games based on their content, exactly as the Motion Picture Association of America had done for films since the 1960s. The first game to receive a mature rating under this new system was Mortal Kombat itself, the very game whose existence had made the rating system necessary. So the franchise that was targeted by the United States Senate for threatening American culture ended up not being banned, not being restricted, and not being diminished in any meaningful way. Instead, it ended up creating the regulatory infrastructure that the entire gaming industry still operates under today, 30-plus years later. Every time a parent looks at the rating label on a video game before deciding whether to buy it for their child, they are interacting with a system that exists because of Mortal Kombat. The franchise did not just survive the attempt to suppress it, it permanently shaped the industry-wide framework through which all entertainment content is now understood and categorized. You genuinely could not invent a better irony if you tried. The politicians from 1993 would probably have a meltdown looking at the fatalities from recent installments, which are far more grisly than they were 30 years ago, and yet the rating system their hearings inadvertently created has kept those games on shelves, legal, and profitable for 3 decades. The irony compounds itself with every new Mortal Kombat release. Wikipedia. Now let us talk about the specific historical origins of the franchise, because they are genuinely extraordinary. The official arcade release happened on October 8, 1992, and the cabinet initially shipped in plain white with a handwritten Mortal Kombat sticker. This is the humble physical beginning of one of the most culturally significant entertainment franchises in history, a hand-labeled wooden box containing a circuit board and a monitor. Where Street Fighter II presented colorful anime-style characters, Mortal Kombat offered photorealistic fighters filmed in live action. The technical innovation behind this realism was a process Midway called digitized sprite architecture. Real martial artists were filmed performing their moves in front of a plain backdrop using a high-8 camcorder, and their recorded movements were then compressed and integrated into the game as character animations. The entire game was developed in 10 months by a 4-person team at Midway Games. 4 people. 10 months. A hand-labeled cabinet. This is what changed the course of entertainment industry regulation for the next 30 years and produced a franchise that is still generating Hollywood blockbusters in 2026. Finthizmovie Plus 2. According to Richard DeVizio and Daniel Pacina, Mortal Kombat had actually begun when Tobias, along with DeVizio and the brothers Daniel and Carlos Pacina, planned to create a ninja-themed fighting game. However, this idea was rejected by Midway's management. Instead, Midway sought to make an action game based on the upcoming movie Universal Soldier and featuring a digitized version of martial arts film star Jean-Claude Van Damme. But he was already in negotiations with another company for a video game that ultimately was never released. This is a historical detail of enormous irony that the 2026 film engages with directly and brilliantly through Johnny Cage. Van Damme was parodied in the game in the form of Johnny Cage, a narcissistic Hollywood movie star who performs a split punch to the groin in a nod to a scene from Bloodsport. So Johnny Cage, the character who is the comedic heart of Mortal Kombat 2, played by Karl Urban with such magnificent self-awareness, exists in his current form because Jean-Claude Van Damme turned down the original game. The franchise that was supposed to feature Van Damme as its star instead created a satirical version of him, and that satirical version became one of the most beloved characters in the entire franchise. 3 decades later, Karl Urban plays that satirical version of Van Damme in a Hollywood film, and does so while making explicit references to the action star tradition that inspired the character in the first place. The layers of meta-irony in that casting choice and that performance are genuinely dizzying when you trace them all the way back to their origin. YouTube. Another of the great ironies embedded in the franchise's history is the one surrounding the palette swap, a technical solution to a memory limitation that accidentally became one of the most iconic visual elements in gaming history. To save on memory hardware, the team used palette swapping, changing the color of the same ninja sprite to create Scorpion in yellow, Sub-Zero in blue, and the hidden character Reptile in green. The 3 ninja characters that became the absolute icons of the franchise, the characters whose imagery appears on merchandise, tattoos, Halloween costumes, and movie posters around the world, were not 3 separately designed and crafted characters. They were one character recolored. The entire visual identity of Scorpion and Sub-Zero, 2 of the most recognized video game characters ever created, exists because the development team did not have enough memory to create distinct sprites for each character. A hardware limitation that should have been an embarrassing shortcut became the defining aesthetic of the franchise's most beloved figures. This is the kind of accident that entertainment history is full of, but rarely so completely and perfectly ironic as this. Movie Film Blog. The irony of Johnny Cage's character arc in Mortal Kombat 2, both within the story of the film and in his broader relationship to the franchise's history, deserves its own extended examination because it operates on multiple levels simultaneously. Within the film, Johnny Cage is a man who has spent his entire career performing heroism on screen, making martial arts films, playing action heroes, constructing a public image built on invincibility and physical mastery, who then discovers that all of that performed heroism has not actually prepared him for the real thing in any meaningful way. He is a man who has practiced the costume of courage for decades without ever having to wear the actual thing. The irony of his arc is that the very skills he developed for his film career, the martial arts training, the physical conditioning, the ability to endure punishment, turn out to be entirely real and genuinely useful, but only when he stops performing them and starts actually living them. His awakening as a champion is not the discovery of something new inside him. It is the moment when he stops pretending to be what he already is. This mirrors something genuinely profound about the relationship between performance and authenticity that runs through the entire film. Kitana has spent 20 years performing the role of Shao Kahn's loyal daughter, constructing a false identity over her true one so completely that even the people closest to her do not know where the performance ends and the person begins. Liu Kang has spent years performing the role of the Chosen One, the prophesied champion who will defeat Shao Kahn, and it is only when he is fatally wounded and released from that performed identity that he discovers his actual destiny, which is something far more extraordinary. Kano, in a deeply ironic counterpoint, is the only character in the film who is absolutely and completely authentic at all times. He is entirely and transparently himself in every single moment, with no gap between what he presents to the world and what he actually is, which in his case means being consistently, comprehensively, and without apology one of the worst people in any realm. His inability to be corrupted by Quan Chi is itself an irony. He cannot be made worse than he already is, which inadvertently makes him useful to the forces of good. The irony of the tournament structure itself is one of the film's most historically resonant conceits. The entire premise of Mortal Kombat, that the fate of entire civilizations is determined by the outcomes of one-on-one combat between champions, is a concept with genuine deep historical roots that also represents one of history's greatest ironies. The idea of trial by combat, of settling disputes between peoples or powers through single or limited combat rather than full-scale warfare, appears in cultures around the world across thousands of years of human history. Medieval European legal tradition included formal trial by combat as a legitimate judicial procedure. Ancient Norse culture had the holmgang, a formalized single combat ritual for settling disputes. Japanese samurai culture had deeply codified traditions of formal dueling. Across Chinese history, the concept of the champion warrior who fights on behalf of an entire army or people is a recurring element in both mythology and historical practice. The Mortal Kombat tournament draws on all of these traditions simultaneously. But the irony is that in every culture that practiced these traditions, the underlying assumption was that divine justice or cosmic truth would favor the righteous combatant, that the outcome of the combat reflected something real and meaningful about who deserved to prevail. Mortal Kombat 2 demolishes this assumption completely and deliberately. Shao Kahn cheats. He acquires the amulet of Shinnok through treachery, uses it to make himself immortal, and then enters a tournament that is supposed to be governed by the rules of the Elder Gods while operating entirely outside those rules. The villain of the piece wins his initial advantages not through strength or skill or righteousness but through corruption and deception, and the film's ultimate message is that a system built on the assumption of fair play can be defeated by someone willing to simply ignore its rules entirely. The champions of Earthrealm do not defeat Shao Kahn by outfighting him within the tournament's framework. They defeat him by going outside the framework entirely, destroying the source of his cheating, and then engaging him in a fight where none of the tournament's cosmic rules apply. The irony is that the only way to save a system built on honor is to step completely outside it. The historical irony of the film's production timeline is also worth examining carefully. Mortal Kombat 2 began principal photography in June 2023, a moment of enormous optimism for a franchise returning to the big screen with a bigger budget, a more ambitious story, and the addition of Karl Urban to the cast. Within weeks, the SAG-AFTRA strike brought production to a complete halt. The sequel was officially greenlit in January 2022, eventually receiving an even bigger reported budget of $80 million. The film that was supposed to be the glorious fulfillment of a franchise promise. The tournament that fans had been waiting for since 1992. The film that would finally put Shao Kahn on screen. The film that would bring Johnny Cage into the franchise at last. Was stopped cold by a labor dispute about the very nature of creative work in the modern entertainment industry. The irony of a film about warriors fighting for the survival of their realm being shut down by workers fighting for fair wages and creative rights is not lost on anyone who thinks about it carefully. And the strike itself, which was partly driven by Hollywood studios' increasing embrace of artificial intelligence as a potential substitute for human creative labor, interrupted a film that was itself a product of decades of human creative tradition, built on the martial arts expertise of real human performers, the mythological knowledge of real human scholars, and the cultural heritage of real human civilizations. The SAG-AFTRA strike was, in part, a fight about whether human creative labor would be valued and protected as artificial intelligence became more capable of simulating it. Mortal Kombat 2, a franchise built on the digitized images of real human bodies performing real human movement since 1992, was among the productions caught in the middle of that fight. The historical resonance is genuinely striking. IMDb. The irony of the film's box office performance relative to its cultural significance is another layer worth excavating. Mortal Kombat 2 is a franchise installment with a genuinely extraordinary cultural legacy. It represents the culmination of a story that began with a game that changed the regulatory history of an entire industry, produced some of the most recognizable characters and imagery in global entertainment, introduced Asian martial arts mythology to a mainstream audience that had never engaged with it before, and built a fan community spanning 3 decades and every inhabited continent on Earth. The film grossed $63 million in its opening weekend globally, which was below projections and below the kind of numbers that would make a studio feel entirely comfortable about the franchise's future. A film carrying 34 years of cultural history, made for $80 million, competing in a summer marketplace that included The Mandalorian and Grogu and multiple other major studio tentpoles, ended up in the middle of the pack commercially. The film grossed $129 million worldwide on an $80 million production budget, which sounds like a success until you factor in the standard Hollywood accounting principle that a film typically needs to earn approximately 2.5 times its production budget to break even when marketing costs and theater revenue splits are included. Meaning Mortal Kombat 2 needed somewhere in the neighborhood of $200 million to be considered genuinely profitable. The franchise that changed the gaming industry, that forced the creation of a rating system still in use today, that introduced a generation of Western audiences to Asian martial mythology, ended up needing a third film to justify its own continued existence. The gap between cultural significance and commercial performance is one of the entertainment industry's most persistent and frustrating ironies, and Mortal Kombat 2 sits squarely inside it. IMDb Wikipedia. The sequel's self-aware humor complicates this debate. Consequence of Sound praises the film for taking the piss out of itself whenever possible, suggesting that by acknowledging its own absurdity, Mortal Kombat 2 sidesteps accusations of taking itself too seriously. This is itself a historically loaded observation. A franchise that began as something genuinely transgressive and dangerous, something that scared senators and alarmed parents, and generated genuine public concern about its cultural impact, has evolved into a property that survives primarily by being in on the joke about itself. Johnny Cage calling Raiden Gandalf, comparing the tournament to Squid Game, describing the entire interdimensional death competition as a murder party with no referees, all of this is the franchise winking at its own mythology, acknowledging that the cosmic stakes it takes so seriously in one breath are also, in another breath, completely ridiculous. The game that once made politicians genuinely afraid of its influence on children is now a film in which the most commercially successful character is a self-aware parody of the genre the game helped create. The danger has been domesticated into entertainment, and the entertainment has turned its own domestication into a joke, and the joke is part of what makes it work. This is cultural irony operating at the highest level. A property that genuinely changed the world is now most effective when it acknowledges that it knows how silly it is. The Direct. During the climax, Johnny, played by Karl Urban, makes a reference to the Lord of the Rings trilogy, saying one ring to rule them all when comparing the amulet of Shinnok to the One Ring. Karl Urban played Eomer in those very movies. This is the film engaging in what is called the celebrity paradox. A moment where an actor references a work they themselves appeared in, creating a loop of self-reference that the film is entirely aware of and entirely comfortable with. It is a small moment, but it encapsulates something important about what Mortal Kombat 2 is doing throughout its runtime. It is a film that knows exactly what it is, knows exactly where it comes from, knows every level on which it can be read and understood and laughed at, and has decided to embrace all of those levels simultaneously rather than choosing between them. TV tropes. The historical arc of the Mortal Kombat film franchise itself contains a deeply satisfying irony that the 2026 film completes. The 1995 Paul W. S. Anderson film, which the franchise's original creators and subsequent stewards have always had a complicated relationship with, was a product of an era when Hollywood did not know how to take video game properties seriously. It made a Mortal Kombat film without putting the tournament in it. The 2021 reboot, which the franchise's fans welcomed with enormous enthusiasm, was a film that built an entire world around the tournament without actually showing the tournament. And then Mortal Kombat 2 finally arrives, after 34 years of franchise history, and puts the tournament on screen in full. Every fight, every fatality, the full Shao Kahn confrontation, the complete arc that the games have been building since 1992. It took 4 films and 31 years from the release of the first game to make a Mortal Kombat film that actually contains a complete Mortal Kombat tournament. That is either a supreme irony or a supreme patience, depending on how generously you want to read it. Most likely it is both simultaneously. One critic observed that Mortal Kombat 2 might be one of the most faithful video game adaptations ever made, and used that as a criticism. The irony embedded in that observation is the most perfect summary of everything the franchise has always been and everything it will always struggle with. Being completely faithful to Mortal Kombat means being completely faithful to something that was designed to be an arcade game, an entertainment format built around 30-second encounters that reward immediate visceral stimulation rather than sustained narrative engagement. A perfectly faithful Mortal Kombat film is one that prioritizes spectacular individual fights over coherent storytelling, that moves from encounter to encounter at the pace of a coin-operated machine rather than a 3-act drama, that values the spectacle of the fatality over the emotional weight of the character moment. And a perfectly faithful Mortal Kombat film is, for exactly these reasons, a film that critics will always find frustrating and audiences will always find entertaining, in exactly the proportions that Mortal Kombat 2 achieved. The franchise's greatest strength and its most persistent creative limitation are the same thing: its absolute fidelity to its own nature. Black Girl Nerds. Ed Boon appearing in the film as a bartender is the historical grace note that ties all of this together. The man who created the entire universe, who wrote the mythology, designed the characters, and built the game that changed the entertainment industry's regulatory history, shows up in the Hollywood adaptation of his creation, serving drinks to Carl Urban's Johnny Cage and delivering a dry line about expecting him to be more animated. The creator of one of the most consequential entertainment franchises in history appears in its biggest film as a background character in a bar. He is credited as a bartender. He has 2 cameos, one visual, one vocal, and the vocal one is the iconic phrase "Get over here," which is Scorpion's signature line and one of the most recognizable pieces of audio from any video game ever made. The man behind all of it walks into his own creation, serves a drink, and disappears. It is humble, it is funny, it is knowing, and it is exactly right, the perfect encapsulation of what Mortal Kombat has always been at its best. Serious enough to build a mythology that has lasted 34 years, and self-aware enough to laugh at what it has become.